Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me, and thank you for that introduction, Nan. Um, so yeah, we'll just get right into it.
Yeah, we don't have a clicker, so.
Okay. There we go. Okay. We'll go over here. So we're going to cover a multitude of topics. First, we're going to start with interactive activities and talk about principles of regenerative agriculture. And then we're going to talk about the rhizophagy cycle and the nitrogen cycle, which are connected to those principles. And then human nutrition and the New Earth Project, and some closing thoughts. And this picture is of some of the living Earth that the New Earth Project creates. Okay, so there's this list of things, and I'm going to ask you guys whether you think the statements are true or false. And you can do a little thumbs up or thumbs down and look around and see what other people think too. It's kind of interesting. Okay, so the first one is that plants and or their roots compete with each other. What do you guys think? Um, So that's more or less false. A lot of plants do better when they're growing with other plants and growing together. So one of the principles of regenerative agriculture is to maximize biodiversity. So we'll talk more about that when we're done with this, but maybe I should stay over here. Okay, so the second one is that soil needs to rest. What do you guys think?
On again.
So we're going to say that one's also false. Of course, there's like extenuating circumstances, I guess, but for the most part, that's false. And another principle of regenerative agriculture is to keep the soil covered. So you've probably heard of cover crops. And again, we'll talk more about that. Okay, and so then the third one, soil can be depleted of NPK, which is magnesium, phosphate, and potassium. And this also kind of works with nitrogen, like soil can be depleted of nitrogen. So what do you think? Is soil often depleted of those nutrients?
So, I have to go this way now.
Okay. So kind of no, again. A lot of soil has all of the nutrients it needs. The problem is that the plants have trouble accessing it because their roots don't have a good partner to help them get it. So we'll talk about that too. And then maybe I accidentally spoiled the next one, but soil needs tilling. What do we think about tilling? Okay, I'm seeing some thumbs down. That's good. Tilling is pretty bad. Yeah. Okay. And then the final one is that plants take from the soil. So do plants deplete the soil of nutrients and take a lot from it? What do you think? Well, I'm going to say no again. What a surprise. Another principle is to maintain living roots in the soil, and we'll talk more about all of these things. Okay, so now I'll move over here. This diagram here, we're going to have some out by the juice and cake, but each of these symbols sort of represents a principle of regenerative agriculture. And of course, the ones out there have explanations. So let's start with maintain living roots. It's all complicated because it all ties in with it itself. So we'll talk more about it, but there are microbes in the soil that help plants get the nutrients and stuff that they need. And so when there aren't any plants in the soil, the microbes kind of dissipate and some of them die, which makes it harder for plants to grow back. So it's important that there's always a living root in the soil to keep those microbes fed. And that relates to the rhizophagy cycle. Yeah, and yeah, we'll leave it there. So then the next one is maximizing biodiversity. So I want to talk about something called the Jena experiment. It was an experiment in Germany in the early 2000s, and it's actually spelled with a J if you're really curious and you want to look it up. So the Jena experiment, basically what they did is they had this big plot of land along a river, and they separated it into multiple plots. And on each plot, they planted a different amount of plants and plant families. And they wanted to see, you know, which ones grew the best. But what ended up happening is there was a giant flood that flooded all of the plots. And they thought their experiment was ruined because they assumed all the plants would die because of the flood. But what they ended up finding was that the plot with the most plant families growing together was the most resilient. And it came back after the flood, and all the plants were more or less okay. So that's one example of why maximizing biodiversity is important. The Jena experiment also had a couple other findings, including that plants in plots with high diversity have increased biomass, which has to do with carbon sequestration and fighting climate change if you stretch it. And the second finding kind of relates to that too, that the more plant diversity, the more long-term carbon storage in the soil, which is interesting. And then last, diverse ecosystems are more productive and flexible. So that kind of sums it up. Okay, now we're on to keeping the soil covered. So I talked about this a little bit earlier, but it's important to have a living root in the soil. Those two kind of go together, but it's also important that the soil is covered so that it's not leaking. It's not letting go of a ton of moisture, and it's not blowing away if it's really dry. So cover crops are very important, and often cover crops can support microbes too. So, okay. All right, I guess I'll go to know your context. This is sort of just probably the most vague but important principle of regenerative agriculture. And it sort of just means that you should know the context of where you're living. And I think that has a lot to do with sort of keeping in mind indigenous practices. That's how I like to think of it. There were people here a long time ago who had all this stuff figured out. And so it's a good idea to employ some of their techniques. And then integrating animals. So that's kind of a controversial one because, you know, we hear about like cows on the Gila River. They pollute the river and they wear down the riverbanks. But in some cases, animals can be really beneficial to the soil. And it doesn't have to be cows. So at the New Earth Project, we use a lot of worms, which is called vermiculture, I'm pretty sure. And so worms are an example of an animal that's really important to the soil. And there's other animals like that too, that can form sort of symbiotic relationships with plants. And then the last one is minimizing disturbance. So that has to do with plowing and erosion and air quality. So when you're plowing soil, it leads to a lot more erosion because it dries the soil out and it throws it around. And so there are some pretty cool maps that show air quality across the United States. And during plowing seasons in states with a lot of agriculture, the air quality is much worse because of all the kicked up dust. Yeah. But also that dust, it doesn't all just go into the air. Some of it ends up in our waterways. Kind of similar to how after a wildfire, there's a lot of stuff in the river, and that's not good either. Okay. Okay. This This is a very technical slide. Hopefully we can make it through it. So this is the rhizophagy cycle. So I'm gonna just sort of read each one of these steps, maybe stay out of the way. So we're gonna start, it's a cycle, so it's, cyclical. But the first step is that the roots release sugars, creating an exudative zone. So it's like sugars and carbohydrates. You might wonder why they're doing that. They're letting go of some of their food. Well, microbes are drawn to that, and then they enter at the root tip, and they lose their cell walls, and their cell walls are where their nitrogen is. So I think we all know that nitrogen is very important to plants, and so it's really beneficial for the plant to be getting this extra nitrogen. So you can kind of see they have these walls, and then they lose them as they go in the root. And you can call these microbes at this point protoplasts. So the protoplasts are broken down by enzymes in the plant. That's what this E is for. And they release even more of their nutrients. So that might be more like mineral stuff. And then the surviving protoplasts, most of them are broken down, but some do survive, exit through the root hairs. And that's a really important part of the cycle because when they exit, they release ethylene, which triggers growth of the root hairs. And that's some sort of catchphrase. Without the right biology, there is no growth. So it's important. And then finally, the protoplasts are all weak. They don't have their cell walls, so they need sugar to help them rebuild it. And so they're drawn back to the exudate zones. So this is one way that plants sort of give back to the soil. We were talking about whether or not plants deplete soils, and this is sort of a contrast to that. And then another phrase I really like is grow microbes and harvest the sunlight. So if these microbes are healthy, the plants will be healthy, and if your growing will go a lot better. Yeah. Okay. So another cycle, this is the nitrogen cycle, and it's another very technical picture. I'm not going to go through every step here, but you can kind of see where there are those microbes I've been talking about. So there's some nitrogen fixing soil bacteria and nitrifying bacteria. Yeah. So earlier we talked about soils having the nutrients that they need, and there's a metaphor that goes along with that. A lot of farmers put nitrogen on their soil, but the problem with that is that even though the plants look really healthy on top, their roots are not as developed as they should be, which leads to problems down the road. And a good metaphor for that is like this bodybuilder metaphor. You imagine a bodybuilder taking like all sorts of creatine and stuff. They're going to have really big muscles, but their bones are not going to be strong enough to support those muscles. And another fun fact, only 10 to 40% of the nitrogen added to plants is used by the plant. And so a lot of that nitrogen ends up washing away or, getting back into the atmosphere, kind of with the erosion from plowing and tilling. And the stuff that washes away ends up in waterways and causes a phenomenon that you might have heard of called eutrophication. And basically what happens is it makes plants and algae in the water grow a ton, and then they die, and it's kind of complicated, but the water ends up depleted of oxygen. And so that's a problem for fish and other animals in the water that need the oxygen. Dr. Christine Jones reminds people that there are 37,000 tons, so 37,000 tons of nitrogen above every acre, and that's in the atmosphere. So if you keep that in mind, there's no reason you'd ever need to dump liquid nitrogen on your plants because with the right nitrifying bacteria, they can get it themselves. And so why would you buy nitrogen when you can get it for free by taking care of your soil? And kind of similar to nitrogen, we've got carbon. So the liquid carbon versus degradation pathways. This is, maybe an equation you're familiar with. It's photosynthesis. So, water, carbon, sugar, oxygen, that's, sunlight or the plant doing the work. Yeah, so with those microbes, they make photosynthesis possible and sugars are exchanged for nutrients and root exudates are put into the rhizosphere and carbon is locked in the soil. So yeah, if you think about that relationship with the bacteria taking nitrogen out of the air, they're taking other things out of the air and those are getting locked in the soil. Versus your degradation pathway, which is kind of a harsh word to describe compost, which so many of us know and love. But compost ends up kind of just rotting and releasing sometimes 98% of the carbon back into the atmosphere. So you are getting a little bit from compost, but it's short term, which is the main difference. The carbon that gets into the soil with the microbes is there for much longer. And yeah, whereas with compost, it returns to the air. Yeah. Kind of like if you were to burn wood, but just at a slower rate. So I've been talking a lot about microbes. I thought it might be kind of cool to show you a picture of some microbes. So this is actually not from the New Earth Project, but the New Earth Project uses adapted Johnson-Su bioreactors, which I'll talk more about. And so this slide is from some compost from one of those bioreactors. So it's got a lot of good things in it. And yeah, you can just see that there's a lot of diversity, which is good. Oh, and it's not just fungi and bacteria, which is what I've been talking about. There's also protozoa and nematodes, which provide important services. Okay, human nutrition. How does this affect us? So this is a quote from the National Institute of Health, one of their studies. The nutrient exhaustion started long ago, but after 1900, the rate of dilution increased incessantly, and after the Green Revolution, exponentially. So I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the Green Revolution. Rachel Carson talks about it in Silent Spring. Basically, after World War II, we had all this chemical knowledge left over, and we wanted to use it to feed the growing world population and the growing United States population. So that's sort of when the use of fertilizers, but also, as Rachel Carson talks about, pesticides really took off. So this is from the same study, these numbers, but basically in the study, they compared the nutrition of apples from 1975 to the nutrition of apples in 1997. And they found that overall, the apples were losing nutrition. So they had 30% less phosphorus and 41% vitamin A and 40% less iron. So if you think about that, an apple is not quite what it used to be. You're not getting as much nutrients as you might hope or expect. And they actually did this with a ton of different foods. Apples were not even the most affected fruit. Things like bananas are even less nutritious. So, and that's important because food is medicine, obviously it's not quite modern medicine, but having a good diet goes a long way in supporting your health. So if the food you're eating, even though they're fruits and vegetables, aren't giving you the nutrients that you need, that's a problem. Okay, so now we've got some photos. I'm going to talk about the New Earth Project after this slide, but wanted to give you a preview. This is the project's current location at the old Chinese gardens, kind of by the San Vicente Creek. And so these are the bioreactors. What a nice little field. You can even see some of the mobile bioreactors, which we call bioreactor tractors down here, these little square things. Yeah, there's a lot going on. This is the barn. It's fairly new, but the barn is nice because that way, if there's a bioreactor filling and it's raining, you're not getting soaked and there's not water getting into the ingredients. So the New Earth Project takes food from elementary schools, and we'll talk about that, but these are some kids separating out their leftover lunch from trash for the bioreactors. And all of the bioreactors have something growing in top of them. That's one of the parts of the process. Around the time worms are added, some plants are planted too, to sort of just, keep a living root in the soil. And yeah, a lot of the plants growing at the garden right now are edible. And so the hope is that it's kind of like a community garden. I was fortunate enough to try some yellow watermelon last summer, and it was very good. And it was crazy. There was just like watermelons hanging out of the bioreactor. Okay. The New Earth Project. Okay. Yeah. So the process. I talked about how the students separate their leftover lunch from trash. And so then volunteers or paid volunteers from the New Earth Project go to all the schools, the elementary schools, and they pick up that leftover food. And so there's 4 schools that we're currently collecting from, which amounts to about 1,000 elementary students, which is a lot. And I like to think about too that these kids are not just, giving their leftover lunch away, but they're thinking about what happens to food that they don't eat in a much deeper way than, when I was in elementary school, the teachers used to always tell us, like, there are kids starving in Africa, you need to eat all your food. And so now they're thinking about, well, I can not eat all my food and be overly full, but that food can still go somewhere helpful. Yes, so we're changing mindsets, and that mindset will stick with the kids for hopefully the rest of their life. So as they go on and they become an adult, they will hopefully keep a compost bin. And the other thing is that the schools used to give us a lot more leftover food, but because it was so much leftover food, the volunteers talked to the school cafeterias, and now the cafeterias offer the kids more choice in what they eat for lunch. And so there's less leftovers overall, which is a good thing. So after the food's picked up, it's in these compostable garbage bags, and somebody has to grind it, which is probably the most disgusting job, but I also think it's the most satisfying job. It's kind of fun. You get to see what the kids ate for lunch. And so we're not eating for lunch, yes. And so how that works is there's a sink in the barn. And the sink has a garbage disposal that instead of going into any sort of plumbing system, we put buckets under. And so we grind up the food with some water into this slurry. And then we, put a lid on the buckets and they sit until the next bioreactor filling. So when school's in session, bioreactor fillings happen on Fridays. And let's see. Yeah, I guess I should tell you what a bioreactor is. They're modified Johnson-Su bioreactors, So they make compost that is rich in those microbes, so that instead of having that degradation pathway, we have a liquid carbon pathway. And so that the plants get more nutrients, so that they can be more nutritious for you and not require pesticides and fertilizers. So the only differences between the New Earth bioreactors and the Johnson-Su bioreactors is that the New Earth bioreactors use urban waste. The Johnson-Su bioreactors did not use food. In fact, the scientists recommended not using food because they thought it'd mess it up. But through some experimentation, we found a way to make it work. And because of that food, the bioreactors do get to higher temperatures, which is important for the commercial side of things, because in order to sell this food mixture, that food needs to be sanitized. So the bioreactors will get up to temperatures of like 140 degrees Fahrenheit, and they'll stay there sometimes for a couple days, and that sanitizes everything. So I don't think you'd really have to worry about getting any diseases from the leftovers, but just in case you were worried, you don't have to be. No, we're still on this slide. Okay, so then the bioreactors have to sit for a while, and most of the ones at the garden right now have been sitting for about 2 years, and then we deconstruct them. Oh, well, at some point during their maturation phase is when we add worms. So the bioreactors, you can think of it as static aerobic vermiculture. So unlike regular compost, it's not being turned, so it's static and it's exposed to oxygen. There's all these, not holes exactly, but ways for the oxygen to get into the compost. So it's in an oxygen-rich environment, and then the worms are vermiculture. So then after they sit for about 2 years, they are deconstructed, where we get the final product of living earth. And living earth has a couple different uses, or I don't know what the word is, but ways forms is a good word. You can have sort of this inoculant powder, which is really rich, which comes from sifting the stuff that comes out of the bioreactor. And you can also have just the mulch, which is straight out of the bioreactor. And then sort of a newer thing we've been trying, which seems to be working really, really well, is to take the mulch from the bioreactors and let it sit for even longer. So those microbes get even more established and the fungi gets more established. And yeah, it's pretty cool because last fall in the mornings, mushrooms would come out from the mulch that was sitting, and then it'd get hotter in the day and they'd wilt, but it was cool to see that happen. So another thing that the New Earth Project does is education, and sort of what's happening at the old Chinese gardens is that they're transforming them into a learning center. So there's the barn, and the barn sounds kind of scary, like calling it the barn, but it's very nice, and it's open air, and there's some nice picnic tables in there. So classes can come down and learn about soil. And we've had classes do that. I know definitely from Aldo, but I think also some of the 4th graders from Jose Barrios. I don't know. But then along with kids, there is farmer outreach, which I was lucky enough to do some of. And there's some stuff about that over here, which we'll get to in a second. But basically, the New Earth Project wants to make sure that their product works, or that our product works. So they are working with farmers to have them test it in their fields and see if it does for them the same thing that fertilizer and or pesticides does. So the other thing about this learning center is between each bioreactor, we plant a native tree, because there's also a native tree nursery on the property. Because the biggest expense for nurseries, which I didn't know, is soil. And so with all this awesome soil, it makes sense to also have a nursery. So there's a native tree planted between each bioreactor. And the hope is that, in a couple decades, all those trees will be big and tall, and there'll be basically this hillside forest out in the middle of the Tyrone kind of deserty area. And the trees are all doing well, so it's a realistic goal. And the bioreactors, when they're deconstructed, some of that mulch ends up on the ground. And so there is also like the soil there is being built up, which is good. Okay, so some statistics. I should have mentioned this before, but each bioreactor contains 600 pounds of food and 1,100 pounds of shredded wood, and then 100 pounds of biochar. So we measure with buckets. It's not, we're not measuring by the pound, but we've done the measurements and that's what they have. So yeah, over 2.5 years that the project has been building bioreactors, there's been 150 bioreactors completed, which has diverted 45 tons of food waste and 90 tons of shredded wood. So instead of going to the dump, all of that is being turned into the best, fertilizer that you could have. Which kind of goes to the farmers. I visited this guy, his name's Cole. He runs Viramonte's farm up near Deming, and they grow a lot of things, including chili. And so he's worked with the New Earth Project for at least one season, and they did a seed coating of a lot of his chili seeds, which is where you mix some of that really good inoculant powder, which is after the bioreactor's done, the sifted mulch, the fine stuff is powder. So you mix that powder with a little bit of milk and a little bit of molasses and water to help it stick to the seeds. And then you plant them just like normal. So the yield was kind of hard to estimate because there was, I guess, this big problem in the last chili season where it was a really great chili year, and the chili cannery, or whatever you would call it, wasn't prepared to handle that, or maybe they had some sort of machinery breakdown. And so when the cannery stops taking chili, the farmers stop harvesting it. And so Cole and the rest of the people at Viramonte's farm were not able to harvest all of the chili that they planted. So it's hard to know, how much more they got than normal, but some rough estimations leave us with that they got 3.5 tons more per acre than with normal fertilizers. And yeah. And it's also been proven in other places that the coated seeds help with drought. And Cole didn't really have a way to measure that, but he thought it was probably true as well. The chili plants just seemed healthier. Yeah. Let me make sure I don't have anything else. Yeah. More pictures. Okay. So these are some kids doing a worm activity. The New Earth Project goes into a lot of schools. I think it's every Tuesday. They go to different classrooms, 4th grade classrooms, and they teach about soil health and worms. Nan could tell you more about that. So these are some kids learning about worms, which is always good to see. This is some food grinding taking place. So here's the unground food, and then that's the sink that it's going to go into. And then this is a bioreactor filling. So before we fill the bioreactors, we have to mix the shredded wood and food and biochar. And I didn't explain this earlier, but biochar is similar to charcoal. It's important because it has a really large surface area, which is good for a lot of things, like drainage, kind of. So we have to mix it all, and we have this big, almost like concrete mixer. And then it comes out of the mixer and it goes into these buckets, and then carry the buckets with a wagon or a wheelbarrow to the bioreactors, which are filled. And yeah, you know the rest. Okay, so these are some final thoughts and facts. I wanted to say earlier with the human nutrition slide that not 85 to 90% of plant nutrition acquisition is microbially mediated. So that's why when the soil is unhealthy, the plants and the food that we get from them aren't as nutrient dense. And so kind of a side note on that is that nutrition will suffer even if the plants are organically grown, because organic doesn't necessarily mean healthy soil with lots of microbes. It just means different pesticides and fertilizers. And I've mentioned pesticides a couple times now. When those plants break I could go back to that slide, but maybe you just remember, the protoplasts have their cell walls where all the nitrogen is. And when the plants break down those walls, that's a tough process and there's a lot of harsh chemicals involved. But because the plants are, exposing themselves to those chemicals, they are getting stronger, which is one of the reasons that plants with healthy soil and healthy microbes are more resistant to disease and bugs. Yes, okay. So now this slide, soil stores 3 times more carbon than the atmosphere. So if you think of all the soil on the earth, that's really where the carbon is. So when we talk about climate change, it's important to keep that in mind because, if you want to take carbon out of the atmosphere, we should focus on putting it into the soil because that's already what the soil is doing. And then this little fact, every 1% increase in organic matter allows soil to hold an additional 20,000 gallons of water per acre. So that kind of ties in with drought resistance and tolerance. That's a lot of water. And you might think, well, there's maybe not that much water on the soil, but places like Tucson actually get 3 times the amount of water the entire city needs during their monsoon season. But a lot of that water runs off or just evaporates back into the air. But with healthy soil, that water can be locked in the ground and then plants can use it when they need it. So kind of going back to this thing, nature has already developed the solutions to climate change. Occasionally you'll read an article about this big new machine that can take carbon out of the air and condense it and get it out of the atmosphere. But those machines are very expensive and very few. And why would we want machines when there's all these awesome plants and soils that'll do the work for free and give us the benefit of food? And the final point is that the agricultural sector needs an overhaul. A lot of these ideas are very new and a lot of farmers would really disagree with them. I mean, but it's not really their fault. It's just the fertilizer companies. They have got to sell the products somehow. And once plants' roots shrink because there's no microbes in the soil and they've been relying on fertilizer, it makes sense that the farmers would need to seek buying fertilizer. So, yes, there has to be an overhaul at some point. And then my final thing to say is that if you are interested in buying any living earth for your garden at home, it is available most Saturdays at the Silver Cities Farmers Market from 9 to 12 p.m. And you can also contact Carol Ann Fugagli. There might be some contact information for her in the Carapace newsletters outside, and she can sell it to you on an individual basis and even give you a tour of the old Chinese gardens. And that's it. So thank you.
Question?
Yes, of
You
course.
mentioned the plant in Tyrone. Where is this plant located? The bio plant, not the living plant.
When I mentioned Tyrone, I was just thinking of where the old Chinese gardens are. They're kind of on that road to Tyrone. I'm not sure if that answers your question. Yeah.
So the context was the native plants growing, right? And creating a forest.
Okay.
In the and I had the sense you were trying to say in an ecosystem similar to what we see when we drive towards Tyrone.
Yes, yeah.
Because it's closer to Silver than to Tyrone.
That's true. Yes. I guess sort of my idea there is when you drive to Tyrone, you don't see a lot of forestry. And, you know, that's mostly probably due to climate change. And when things get hotter, the trees go to higher elevations. So there's not as many at lower elevations. But with healthy soils, there can be forests at lower elevations, and forests are good. So that's it.
Were you able to visit any other farmers besides the
Viramontes, yeah. I did get to go to a farm out in Gila, which is a little bit smaller scale, but they have some greenhouses. And this growing season, they will be implementing, I don't know exactly what kind of new earth products. I think there was talk of like some sprays. You can mix the powder with water and then spray it on the plants or on the soil, and the microbes get in there. So I visited those two farms. Sure.
So you mentioned that as a rough estimate, there was about 3.5 tons more chilies harvested at this farm per acre.
Correct.
Do you have a sense of what percentage increase that is? Like I have no idea how many tons are normally harvested.
You know, I wrote it down somewhere, but when I was picking what to put on the slides, I was like, tons sounds better than percentage. So I went with that. But that number is out there somewhere.
I had the experience of collecting or just monitoring the collection of food scraps at Harrison Schmidt. And it was an amazing thing to see. The kids knew what to do and where to put the different parts of their tray. But I have to say, looking at the food that was served to them, like, how does that turn into something that is better?
Yeah.
I mean, it's really amazing. These microbes are doing some really amazing things.
Yeah.
They can turn food that is pretty traditional school lunch food into like amazing stuff. So
Yeah.
I don't know if there's not really, it's not really a question, it's so much of a comment. Like,
It's a good comment.
has there been a consideration of like, this isn't the best thing to put in, or it's actually like so cool that something that's really not that great to put into our bodies is really good to put into these microbes, take care of the problem?
Yeah, I mean, the microbes are strong. They can make do. And in the Johnson-Su bioreactors or Johnson-Su-like bioreactors have been implemented across the world. And in different places, they use different things. So in some places, they don't have a lot of food waste, so they use banana leaves.
Right.
And I guess, I mean, banana leaves, school cafeteria food, probably similar in nutrition. So I don't know. Yeah.
Because they sit for 2 years,
Right.
and then and so it's about 1/3 food and then 2/3 wood.
And biogens.
Yeah, and so, you know, and all the microbes come from that environment. So, you know, so it ends up being just this very microbial rich material. And when we test it, I mean, the longer it sits, the more kind of fungally dominant it gets. And, you know, clearly whatever bad stuff was there is gone because there's all this living stuff.
Yeah.
So yeah, we that was something that we learned that, wow, I mean, yeah, when it does sit for a couple of years, you really get this incredible mix of microbes.
It's just such an example of resiliency.
Yeah.
It's all about the worms.
Well, mushrooms, and what we know that mushrooms, other fungi can do in cleaning up oil and this,
I would point out that even from elementary school cafeterias, the diversity of food types is very high. And so diversity is important in all of these processes. And so, you know, we have wood coming in from urban silvicultural projects or climate smart forest thinning projects is very diverse. And there's microbes associated with all that different food and all that different food coming in. So they go into these reactors very diverse, and that helps them in their maturation process.
I will say too, there are some things the microbes don't eat and they don't dissolve. I'd always heard that those like fruit tags, do you know what I'm talking about? That they come on your apples and bananas, will like dissolve. And maybe some do, but the ones that end up in our bioreactors don't, because when you sift it, you can pick them out and they've been in there for 2 years, but they're still whole. So, yeah.
Somebody said.
Yes.
I remember the kids moved their oranges that day. And it was just funny, like, they weren't supposed to, because oranges are not supposed to go, I mean, the acid or whatever and some of the kids were like, yeah, oranges are bad. Like, okay, they're still a little, I mean, we help to counter that. Like, they're just not good for the microbes.
Yeah. I think you had a question.
I just want to make a point. Another thing that's bad about using fertilizer is nitrogen and fertilizer by the nitrifying bacteria in the soil. They convert some of it into nitrous oxide, N2O, which is an extremely potent greenhouse gas. It's like 380 times as powerful as CO2 or something like that. It's also rock stable, not like methane that breaks down in the atmosphere. It's a very stable molecule. So it isn't a large amount, but consider the huge amount of fertilizers that are applied all over the planet for agriculture. Nitrous oxide levels are rising significantly on charts of greenhouse gases. And so it is a problem associated with traditional agriculture.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
Does the New Earth project need more wood? Like, as you know, you have all this mortality and people are starting to.
I would not be the person to answer that.
Right.
Mike might know.
Well, we do accept wood down there. It needs we discourage juniper related species because of the tendency to take forever to decompose. Although we can use it in our biochar making process. It's a component of the waste that you bring. We have a chipper that can take, it's a pretty big chipper. It can take up to, we like to chip live material primarily because dead wood is really hard on the blades. But we can take up to 10 inches with this live.
Wow.
And if you do have bigger stumps and so forth, we can use those for building projects. So yes, we have a locked gate down there. There's other landowners, so you have to make an appointment or get a combination from the city.
For other questions, there's nothing in the chat.
So you were saying orange peels are good for the.
I mean, I'm not the expert on it, but that was my understanding as the city, they don't.
Yeah, I mean, you know, if they're serving oranges at the school, there might be like 100 oranges, you know, and in those kinds of quantities, it could have some antibacterial, you know, create kind of an antibacterial environment. If there are oranges in there, we don't send them to the landfill. We kind of separate them out and, you know, in the javelina or, you know, something comes in and eats them. But we just, if, you know, we don't want to put huge quantities of citrus in the reactors.
That's the peels also.
Yeah. And I mean, but that's pretty much, that's the only thing we don't put in there. I mean, unless, you know, they rarely have bones, we don't put the bones in. But yeah, really oranges are the one thing we say, sorry, we just, I can't.
Right.